Everyone expected a quiet funeral that cold Glenhaven night, until the police canine shattered the silence. As the casket opened, the massive German shepherd didn't whine or bow his head. Instead, Ruger leapt inside, curling his body protectively around the little girl everyone believed was gone forever. At first, the townspeople thought grief had broken him, but when Ruger pressed his ear to her chest, then snapped his head toward the doors, as if sensing danger, panic rippled through the room. Officers moved to pull him away, but Ruger growled, a sound he had never used against his own team. Whispers spread like wind through the chapel. Why was he guarding her like someone still alive? And why did he keep nudging her tiny hand, refusing to let anyone near? No one understood his frantic warnings until he began clawing at the coffin lining, barking, trembling, acting not like a grieving dog, but a dog trying desperately to save someone who wasn't gone. A late winter wind carved through Glenhaven, slicing along the stone walls of the old forest church like an invisible blade. Inside the chapel, the air felt heavier than the cold outside, heavy the way sorrow clings to breath. The wooden pews were filled with townspeople wrapped in gray coats and darker grief. Their eyes were drawn toward the small white casket at the front, trimmed with pale lace and illuminated by the soft halo of stained glass light. Officer Eldon Marr, standing nearest to the altar, kept his back straight though his shoulders wanted to fold. He was a man in his early 40s, tall and rough-edged, with a square jaw shadowed by stubble and cold blue eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. The years had carved a certain quiet hardness into him, the kind that grows in men who have lost more than they admit. His sandy brown hair was swept back in an unintentional, almost careless way, a reminder that sleep had not visited him properly in days. Eldon was known in Glenhaven as steadfast but distant, polite, dependable, yet always standing a few emotional steps away from everyone else. The kind of man who, even when surrounded by people, lived mostly alone inside himself. At his feet lay Ruger, his longtime canine partner. Ruger was an 8-year-old German shepherd, broad-chested with a thick winter coat of sable and black, his muzzle beginning to frost with age. His ears were sharp, always alert, but today they drooped slightly, weighed down by a sadness he could not mask. Ruger had served beside Eldon for 6 years, years of search and rescue, tracking lost hikers through snowstorms and facing dangers that bonded them tighter than most humans ever manage. The dog was loyal, disciplined, and steady, but beneath that discipline lived a sensitive creature with a deep instinct for human emotion. And today, that instinct was trembling. The casket contained Marcy Elliston, a 7-year-old girl with wheat blonde hair and skin so pale it seemed carved from moonlight. She had been small, shy, and gentle, known for clutching a worn yellow storybook everywhere she went, and for speaking softly even when excited. Her mother, Sarah Elliston, sat in the front row. Sarah was a slender woman in her mid-30s with long, dark chestnut hair tied loosely behind her shoulders. Exhaustion hollowed her cheeks, and her eyes were rimmed red from weeks of tears. She had once carried a warm, open smile, the kind that made neighbors feel welcomed in her presence, but now her face was fixed in a quiet trembling, like someone clinging to the last strand of sanity. Next to her sat Cameron Elliston, Marcy's father, a broad-shouldered man with graying temples and a stoic expression that cracked only when he thought no one was watching. His hands, large, weather-worn, the hands of a carpenter, shook slightly as he held Sarah's. A hush fell as the funeral director, a thin elderly man named Mr. Rowe, approached the casket and lifted the lid with slow reverence. His wrinkled hands trembled, though perhaps not entirely from age. Then Ruger moved. In a single bound, fast, desperate, instinctual, the dog leapt into the open casket. Gasps rippled through the chapel. Sarah cried out, thinking for a moment that the dog had gone wild in grief. People rose from their seats, shocked, some stepping back while others reached forward as though unsure whether to intervene. But Ruger wasn't attacking. He curled his massive body around Marcy's tiny frame, pressing his muzzle to her chest. A low, guttural whine escaped him, long and trembling. Eldon's breath hitched. He had heard that sound only twice in Ruger's life. Once during a blizzard rescue when they found a boy barely alive under a collapsed cabin, and once when Ruger lost his littermate during training. It was not grief alone. It was alarm, recognition, urgency. "Ruger," Eldon whispered, stepping forward. The dog growled, not a snarl, but a warning. His tail stiffened, and his body shielded the child, as though danger stood only inches away. When a church volunteer, Marta Holcomb, a kind old woman with silver hair and soft hands, attempted to reach toward Marcy, Ruger bared his teeth. Marta withdrew instantly, startled. "Why is he doing that?" Someone murmured. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming anew. "He loved her. He's confused," she whispered, but her voice was thin, uncertain. Eldon shook his head slowly. No. He knew this dog. Ruger did not mistake ritual for threat. He did not guard the dead. He guarded the living. "Easy, buddy," Eldon whispered again. "Let me see." Ruger's eyes lifted to him, dark, wet, and filled with a strain Eldon had never seen before. The dog nudged Marcy's small hand with his nose again and again, then pressed his ear to her chest as if listening for something. Eldon felt a shiver crawl up his spine. This wasn't mourning. This was insistence. This was a message Ruger could not speak, only embody. A storm of whispers filled the chapel. Is he sensing something? Is the dog warning us? What if, before anyone could finish the thought, Ruger clawed at the lining of the casket, whining louder, his whole body trembling in protest. His movements weren't random. Eldon recognized the frantic rhythm. It was the same pattern Ruger used when he found a victim barely clinging to life, hidden under rubble or half-conscious in snow. Ruger thought Marcy was still alive. Eldon's heartbeat thudded in his ears. The world contracting to the casket, the dog, and the still child between them. Every instinct in him, every lesson learned in years of work, told him Ruger was not wrong. And in that frozen instant, as wind howled against the church walls like a warning from the forest itself, Eldon realized the truth. This wasn't a farewell. This was the beginning. 2 months before the funeral, Glen Haven had been held together by the slow-turning rhythm of early autumn, the kind of season where the air smelled faintly of pine and wet earth, and the sun folded itself early into the horizon like a tired lantern. Each evening, Officer Eldon Marr and Ruger followed their patrol route along the narrow road cutting past Cedarfin Marsh, a long stretch of silver-green wetland that looked peaceful from afar but carried its own quiet menace. Eldon had always trusted the place as little as he trusted people who smiled too easily. The marsh had a way of swallowing sound, and sometimes even truth. On those patrols, the highlight was always the same, the small figure waiting at the picket fence of a weathered cottage, Marcy Elliston, holding a paper bag of handmade cookies in both hands. Marcy had pale wheat blonde hair that she often brushed behind her tiny ears in a habitual nervous gesture, and she possessed a gentleness that seemed almost too fragile for a world like Glen Haven. She had few friends, her shyness forming a quiet, invisible wall, but Ruger dissolved that wall effortlessly. Each time he saw her, the rigid posture of a trained K-9 melted into the warm, lumbering gait of a gentle giant. Ruger would trot up to her, tail swinging like a slow pendulum, and she would giggle softly, the sound barely above a whisper, yet carrying enough warmth to make Eldon's stern heart soften in spite of himself. Eldon often stood nearby with arms crossed, pretending he wasn't watching the way Ruger leaned into her small hands, letting her pet the thick fur behind his ears. Eldon's cold blue eyes softened in those moments, though no one ever noticed. It had been many years since he'd allowed himself to care about anyone other than Ruger. Life had taught him a harsh lesson. Attachments were risks, and risks rarely ended kindly. But Marcy never asked anything of him, only offered cookies to Ruger and shy smiles that never demanded a return. On one of those crisp evenings, the autumn wind rushed across Cedarfen Marsh, bending tall reeds into trembling arcs. A rolling fog crept low over the water like a ghost seeking familiarity. Eldon felt the chill deepen instantly. Ruger stiffened beside him, ears flicking forward. "Easy, boy," Eldon murmured. But Ruger's reaction wasn't fear, it was awareness. He sniffed the air, muscles rippling with silent caution. Across the road, near the Elliston fence, Marcy waved. Today she wore a soft blue sweater and mismatched socks that peeked from her boots. She held the cookie bag high, as if proudly presenting treasure. Eldon cracked a tiny smile. Ruger trotted ahead eagerly, but halfway there he stopped abruptly. A scent, not of nature, not of cookies, swept past him. Ruger's fur bristled. Eldon noticed instantly, because Ruger never bristled without reason. A figure approached from farther down the fog-bound road. As he stepped into clearer view, Eldon recognized Vince Harlow, a patrol officer from Glenhaven's small department. Vince was in his early 30s, tall but lean, with straw-colored hair cut short and a narrow, angular face that always looked one bad day away from cracking. His uniform was immaculate, almost obsessively so, and he walked with the rigid posture of someone who desperately needed the world to believe he was in control. Vince had joined the department only 2 years earlier, arriving from a bigger city where he claimed he'd left due to departmental politics. Eldon, who'd been policing too long to accept vague answers, never bought it. There was something unsettled in Vince's brown eyes, an anxious twitch, a flicker of guilt or defensiveness Eldon couldn't quite define. "Evening, Mar," Vince called out, forcing a tight smile, but Eldon caught the way his gaze darted toward Marcy before snapping back, as if trying too hard to look uninterested. "Evening," Eldon replied curtly. Ruger growled, not loudly, but enough to draw Vince's attention. "What's his problem?" Vince asked, though his tone suggested irritation more than concern. "He thinks before he trusts," Eldon said. "Good trait. You ought to try it." Vince smiled again, but this time it lacked the forced politeness. It was strained, almost bitter. He opened his mouth to retort, but a gust of fog-wrapped wind swept across the marsh, carrying the faint scent of rotting leaves and stagnant water. Ruger stepped closer to Marcy, nudging her gently as she handed him a cookie. She looked up at Eldon shyly. "He likes this one best," she whispered, holding out a star-shaped cookie with a lopsided smile drawn in frosting. Eldon nodded once. "He does." Moments like this, quiet, unassuming, sneaked under Eldon's armor, warming places inside him he thought had long gone numb. But just as he let himself breathe into the gentle routine, Vince stepped closer. "Strange place for a kid to play alone," Vince muttered. His eyes flicked again toward Marcy. Eldon's jaw tensed. "She's with her mother, inside." "Still," Vince said, shrugging. "Accidents happen fast." Ruger growled again, deeper this time. Eldon's instincts sharpened. Ruger never growled repeatedly at the same person unless he had a reason. And Vince suddenly seemed too aware of the fog, of the marsh, of Marcy. "We're done here," Eldon said. "Move along, Harlow." Vince hesitated just long enough to be noticed, then nodded stiffly and walked back toward the main road, disappearing into the thickening fog. Marcy glanced up. "Why does he look at people like that?" she asked softly. Eldon didn't answer. Some truths were too heavy for small shoulders. 2 days later, the call came in. A tragic accident. A child lost her footing, fell from the embankment and struck the concrete path below. The caller, Vince Harlow. Eldon arrived to flashing lights, panicked, shouting, and Ruger, tearing free from his leash, to reach Marcy's small, motionless body. Eldon's world constricted painfully. But even then, amid the chaos, the grief, the sirens, Ruger wasn't looking at Marcy. He was staring at Vince Harlow with eyes filled not with confusion, but accusation. 2 months later, in the silence of the church, Ruger still remembered that scent, and Eldon, for the first time, allowed himself to wonder if the fog of Cedarfen Marsh had hidden more than just water and reeds that day. It might have hidden the truth. The storm rolled into Glenhaven like a living thing, white, snarling, unforgiving. Snowflakes slammed sideways against the stained glass windows of the old forest church, rattling them in their frames as though demanding entry. Inside, the air remained heavy with sorrow, but something colder and sharper had begun to coil beneath it: fear. Ruger had been pacing relentlessly at the base of the altar since the moment he leapt from Marcy's casket. His thick winter coat, sable blending into black, was puffed with tension, each hair bristling like a field of needles. His eyes flickered from the child lying still inside the casket to the door of the chapel, to Eldon, and then back again with restless insistence. Eldon Marr stood near the front pews, watching his partner with growing alarm. The soft light of the chandeliers etched shadows along Eldon's jaw, angular, strong, but tight with a worry he tried to hide. The storm outside roared like some great beast clawing the walls, yet the real storm, Eldon realized, was in Ruger's trembling chest. Sarah Elliston, still slender and ghost-pale, sat slumped in the first pew, her long, dark chestnut hair disheveled from hours of crying. Her hands, small, cold, trembling, were locked together in silent prayer, or perhaps in silent desperation. Cameron Elliston stood behind her, his broad shoulders hunched, his graying beard wet with melting snow. He had stepped outside minutes before, trying to breathe through the grief that made his chest feel too tight, when Ruger suddenly threw his head back and released a sharp, piercing bark, one filled with a wild blend of urgency and dread. Every head in the chapel snapped toward him. Then Ruger ran, not a gentle trot or confused pacing, a sprint, straight toward the church doors. Eldon reacted instantly. "Ruger!" But the dog didn't stop. He slammed his body against the wooden doors and scratched hard, claws clicking like frantic warnings. His breath came in fast, visible bursts of fog in the cold air seeping from beneath the doors. "He wants out," whispered Marta Holcomb, the elderly church volunteer, her silver hair trembling as she spoke. Eldon hesitated only a moment before grabbing his gloves. "I'm following him." No one argued. The storm outside was brutal, but Ruger's behavior was more brutal still. Something was calling him, or rather, something familiar was pulling him. When Eldon shoved open the door, the gale-force wind nearly tore it from his hand. Snow blasted into his face like icy shrapnel. Ruger didn't wait. He darted into the white chaos, leaving deep paw prints that were instantly softened by drifting snow. Eldon pulled his coat tighter and followed with long strides. Ruger never ran without purpose. He tracked the dog through Glenhaven's narrow streets, past shuttered shops buried in snowdrifts and lampposts flickering under the weight of ice. Ruger moved with the precision of a creature following a scent, burned into his bones. Eldon recognized the direction almost immediately, toward the police station, more specifically toward the old equipment shed behind it. The shed no longer appeared on official maps. It was a leftover structure from the department's early years, built from warped wood and corrugated metal that screeched whenever wind slammed into its rusted sides. Most officers avoided it. Some joked it was haunted by the ghost of old evidence. Tonight, the shed looked like a hunched shadow at the edge of the storm. Ruger slowed as he approached it, his paws sinking deep into the fresh snow. He sniffed once, twice, then pushed his shoulder against the door. The hinges screeched in protest. Eldon stepped in behind him, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing dust motes swirling like tiny ghosts. The interior smelled of mildew, cold metal, and something else, something earthy. Ruger stopped at the far corner, tail stiff, nose pressed to the concrete. Eldon approached cautiously. The first thing he saw was a small hair clip, shaped like a crescent moon and coated in dried clay, the same pale gray clay that clung to the banks of Cedarfen Marsh. Marcy's hair clip. Next to it lay a miniature security camera, its casing cracked and lens shattered. Eldon crouched down, brushing the dust away. The camera was a portable model, something someone would use to record discreetly, not something issued by the department. He felt his pulse quicken. Beside that, partially buried under an old tarp, lay a single glove, black, thick, and smeared with sticky amber resin. Eldon lifted it carefully. He rubbed the residue between his fingers. The texture was unmistakable. Tree sap, from the marsh pine that grew only along the cedar fin waterline. His stomach tightened. Whoever had worn that glove had been at the marsh that day, the day Marcy fell. Before Eldon could process further, Ruger nudged a metal toolbox near Eldon's knee. The dog's ears flattened. He whined, a trembling, pained sound. Eldon opened the box. His breath left him. Inside, folded crudely, was a torn piece of fabric, pink with small embroidered daisies. Marcy's shirt, ripped from the shoulder, hidden here, and someone in the department had access to this shed. Someone who wanted the truth buried under dust. Someone who believed the storm would swallow the scent of guilt. But Ruger had remembered, and the storm only seemed to sharpen the trail. A violent gust slammed into the shed, shaking the walls. Ruger barked once, sharp, urgent, then looked toward the back exit of the shed where snow seeped through the cracks. Eldon understood immediately. They weren't alone. Not tonight, not in this storm, and the truth, like the wind, was finally coming for them. The storm had begun to quiet, but the night remained thick with cold, so cold it seemed to hollow out the silence itself. Snow still drifted across the abandoned police shed in thin, ghostly ribbons as Eldon Marr pushed Vince Harlow toward the rear entrance of the station. Ruger walked beside them in a rigid, stalking posture, head low, ears pinned forward, every muscle taut with instinctive fury. Vince stumbled when the icy wind slapped his face. His normally neat blonde hair was plastered wet against his forehead, and sweat, cold, sharp-smelling, clung to his temples. Though younger than Eldon by nearly a decade, something jittery and prematurely worn haunted Vince's features, dark crescents under his eyes, a constant twitch in his jaw, and a thin-lipped grimace that revealed a man always bracing for impact. Inside the station's back hallway, dimly lit, quiet, except for the radiator clanking tiredly, Eldon shoved Vince into interview room 2, an aging concrete-walled space that smelled faintly of steel chairs and old cigarettes. The overhead light flickered before holding steady, washing Vince's face in a harsh, yellow glare. Ruger positioned himself at the door, blocking the exit like a living barricade. Eldon didn't sit. He stood over Vince, arms crossed, breath steady. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the table. His face, square-jawed, stubbled, still flushed from the storm, had shifted from suspicion to hardened certainty. "Start talking," Eldon said. His voice was low, but edged with a kind of quiet threat that came from years of dealing with liars. Vince laughed, a short, brittle sound that cracked halfway out of his throat. "You can't just drag me in here. I did nothing wrong." Ruger growled, a deep, guttural vibration, the kind that came from a place beyond training, pure instinct. Eldon leaned forward slightly. "Ruger disagrees." For a brief second, Vince's face blanched. His gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Eldon. "He's just a dog. He's better at reading people than you ever were," Eldon replied. The silence stretched until it felt tight enough to snap. The storm gusted faintly against the window. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and went unanswered. Finally, Vince's shoulder twitched. "What do you want?" "The truth," Eldon said evenly. "From the beginning." Vince swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed like a trapped pebble, but when he still didn't speak, Eldon dropped the first piece of evidence onto the table. Marcy's moon-shaped hair clip, still dusted with Cedarfin's clay. Then the broken mini camera, then the sap-stained glove, finally the torn piece of Marcy's shirt. Vince stared at the small pile as though he had been punched in the chest. He blinked once, then again, rapidly, like someone trying to stay ahead of panic. Eldon's tone hardened. "We found these in the old storage shed, in a toolbox only officers with keys can access." Vince shut his eyes. "You don't understand." "Then explain it." Silence clawed the air once more. Ruger growled again, louder, sharper. The dog's hackles rose as Vince's heartbeat quickened. When Vince finally spoke, the words carried the shaky weight of a truth he had tried too long to bury. She wasn't supposed to be outside that close to the marsh." Eldon's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. "Go on." "I didn't mean for anything to happen," Vince whispered, voice cracking. I needed to talk to her mother, Sarah Elliston." Eldon frowned. "Why?" The answer came slow and shameful. "She filed a complaint, said I made her uncomfortable." Eldon exhaled through his nose, a sound halfway between anger and disgust. Sarah, slender and soft-spoken as she was, had always carried a sense of quiet vulnerability. Eldon suddenly remembered her trembling hands at the funeral, the haunted look in her eyes. "What did you do, Vince?" "I didn't touch her," Vince snapped, but the panic in his voice undercut the conviction. I just wanted to convince her to take back the complaint, to stop talking about it." "And you went to Cedarfin Marsh to do that?" Eldon asked coldly. "It's quiet there," Vince muttered. "Private." Ruger took a step forward, teeth bared. Eldon raised a hand, not to stop the dog, but to hold Vince's attention. "So why was Marcy involved?" At that name, Vince's face broke. Tears slipped down his cheek, indistinguishable from the snowmelt. "I didn't know she'd followed her mother. I didn't even see her at first." He pressed shaking hands to his temples. "She surprised me, came up behind me while I was talking to Sarah. I grabbed her without thinking, just to keep her quiet. She screamed." Ruger let out a sharp bark that echoed off the concrete walls. Vince's voice shrank. "She fought harder than I expected. She was just a kid, but she kept kicking, pulling away." He sniffed hard. "And then she slipped." "Slipped?" Eldon repeated, his voice icy. "She backed too close to the edge, lost her balance." "You staged the fall," Eldon said. "The glove, the clay, the broken camera." Vince's silence confirmed it. Eldon leaned forward, face inches from Vince's. "What about the shirt? Why was it torn?" Vince's lips trembled. "I tried to pull her back." "No," Eldon said. "You tried to hide the evidence." Vince's breath hitched. "I panicked." Ruger emitted a deep growl, vibrating through the metal legs of the table. Vince flinched. "You don't understand. I never meant to hurt her. I swear on—" "Don't," Eldon cut in. "Don't pretend you're the victim." The interrogation room felt suddenly smaller, as though the storm outside had pressed the walls inward. Eldon's cold blue eyes glinted with a fury he normally buried deep under duty. Ruger knew it. "Was you at the funeral?" Eldon said quietly. "He smelled you on her clothes, on the fear she carried in her last moments." Vince's eyes darted wildly like a trapped animal seeking a corner to disappear into. "Please," he whispered, "please, I didn't mean—" But Ruger's bark cut through the room like a crack of thunder. The dog lunged forward, teeth flashing, stopped only by Eldon's firm hand. Vince shrank back in the chair, trembling violently. Eldon stepped between them, staring down at the man before him, the man who had shattered a small, gentle life and then dared to dress it in lies. "This is over," Eldon said. "You'll answer for this." Outside, the last winds of the storm howled through the night, like the echo of Marcy's final cry. And for the first time in months, Eldon felt the path ahead clearing, not brighter, not safer, but unmistakably real. Ruger, standing beside him, had never looked more certain. Morning arrived cautiously over Glen Haven, as though the town itself feared what daylight might reveal. The storm had finally exhausted its rage, leaving behind a landscape sculpted in white, rooftops weighted with snow, streets muted by drifts, and the sky washed in a pale, trembling gold. The cold still bit sharply, but it no longer howled. It simply lingered, fragile and exhausted, like a lingering bruise on the world. Officer Eldon Marr stepped out of the station into that quiet dawn with Ruger at his side. The dog moved slowly, not from fatigue, but from a solemn alertness. Ears rotating, nose twitching, posture firm. The night's revelation still echoed between them, and Eldon's mind replayed every detail. The torn shirt, the clay, the sap, the broken camera, and Vince Harlow's final broken confession. But even as those truths settled heavy in Eldon's chest, something else gnawed at him, a faint thread of dread he couldn't untangle. It arrived in the form of a phone call. Eldon's phone buzzed in his coat pocket, and he answered automatically. The voice on the line was tight, urgent, yet trembling with something more than fear. It belonged to Dr. Lee Rowan, Glenhaven Regional Hospital's chief emergency physician. Dr. Rowan was a woman in her early 50s with iron-gray hair cropped neatly at her jawline, sharp cheekbones, and a posture that suggested a lifetime of working on her feet. Her voice normally carried the controlled steadiness of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions, but this morning it wavered. She was known in Glenhaven for her strict professionalism and her almost intimidating calm, traits earned long ago after losing her husband in a highway pileup she couldn't save despite performing CPR herself. That tragedy shaped her into someone who no longer allowed emotion to cloud judgment, but her judgment was shaken now. "Officer Marr," she said, her breath visible as a puff of white in the hospital's cold corridor. "You need to come immediately. It's about Marcy Elliston." Eldon froze. Ruger stiffened, sensing the shift in his handler's heartbeat. "What is it?" Dr. Rowan exhaled shakily. I don't know how to explain this over the phone, but she's not gone. She's showing signs of life." For a moment, Glenhaven fell utterly silent. The wind, the birds, even Eldon's own breathing seemed to halt. Ruger made a soft sound, a whine filled with a depth of emotion Eldon could hardly comprehend. "We're on our way," Eldon said, voice low. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of pale light and wheels sliding softly over icy patches. Ruger stood the entire time, front paws braced, eyes locked on the road, like he knew exactly where they were going. When Eldon rushed through the emergency entrance, cold air clinging to his coat, he found Sarah and Cameron Elliston already there. Sarah looked as though she had been carved from porcelain, fragile, trembling, but suddenly alight with something she had not allowed herself to feel in days: hope. Cameron stood behind her, his large hands gripping her shoulders gently. He looked years older than he had at the funeral, but there was a spark in his eyes now that had been utterly absent. Dr. Rowan led them all down the sterile hallway, her steps brisk but shaky. Her core body temperature dropped dangerously low, she explained, her voice gradually regaining its steadiness. Extreme hypothermia can mimic death. Heart rate slows. Breathing becomes nearly undetectable. In rare cases, very rare, patients can survive what appears to be clinical death. "And she still had signs?" Sarah whispered. "When your dog reacted at the funeral," Dr. Rowan said, glancing at Ruger with something like awe, "we rechecked everything, and just before we were preparing for transfer this morning, her fingers twitched. Once, then again." Sarah covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. Cameron held her tighter, his rough hands trembling. Ruger pressed forward, nose lifting, tail low but quivering. Dr. Rowan pushed open a door softly. "She's in here." The room was dim, filled with the sound of monitors beeping in soft, steady rhythms. Marcy lay in the bed, small and fragile beneath layers of warm blankets. Her cheeks had regained the faintest trace of color, and her tiny chest rose and fell, shallow, uneven, but undeniably alive. Eldon felt his throat tighten painfully. Ruger padded forward slowly, almost reverently. When he reached her bedside, he lifted his head and gently nudged her palm with his nose. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Marcy's fingers curled, weak, trembling, but deliberate. Sarah cried out, half sob, half prayer, as she stumbled toward the bed. Cameron steadied her, though he was shaking himself. Marcy's eyelids fluttered, revealing blue-gray eyes clouded by exhaustion, yet shimmering with life. She turned her head, movements slow like thawing ice, and whispered something so faint the room leaned in to hear it. "Shadi." Ruger's body sagged, a soft whine spilling out of him, low and aching but filled with relief. He rested his head gently beside her arm, eyes wet. Eldon closed his own eyes briefly, letting the weight of everything sink in. The storm, the lies, the truth peeled back layer by layer until the only thing left standing was loyalty. Loyalty stronger than fear, stronger than deception, stronger even than death itself. Behind him, Dr. Rowan wiped her eyes discreetly with gloved fingers. If he hadn't reacted, if he hadn't insisted something was wrong, she shook her head. She would have been prepared for cremation by now. Sarah turned to Ruger, tears streaming freely. "You saved my baby," she whispered. Ruger lifted his head and pressed it against her trembling hand. Cameron, a man weathered by loss and years of quiet endurance, knelt beside the dog. "Good boy," he murmured, voice breaking. Good boy." Eldon stepped closer, placing a steady hand on Ruger's back. The dog leaned into him with a soft exhale. The door swung open as Deputy Harold Granger entered, an older man with a thick gray mustache, a slight limp from an old line-of-duty injury, and a calm, fatherly presence. He was one of Glenhaven's most trusted deputies, known for fairness and a thoughtful, gentle demeanor. His blue eyes were soft but brimmed with emotion as he witnessed Marcy alive. "Internal Affairs is already here," Granger said quietly. "Harlow's in custody. Charges are being filed." Eldon nodded slowly. "And the rest?" Granger wiped snowmelt from his mustache. "We dig deeper. For her." He looked at the child, then at Ruger, then back at Eldon with a mixture of admiration and solemn gratitude. When Granger stepped out, leaving the family alone, Eldon remained by Ruger's side. The winter sun had begun to rise through the hospital window, scattering warm light across Marcy's blanket, gold dissolving the cold blue of dawn. And for the first time in far too long, Glenhaven felt something other than grief. It felt alive again. Everything, Eldon realized, had survived because one dog refused to accept goodbye. And the chapter of silence surrounding Marcy Elliston was finally ending. In the quiet glow of Glenhaven's new morning, as a child opened her eyes against all odds, and a loyal dog laid his head beside hers, it became impossible not to feel that something greater had moved through the storm. Some call it instinct, some call it luck, but others know what they felt in that moment. A breath of grace, a whisper of mercy, a small miracle placed gently into human hands. Sometimes God works through people, and sometimes He sends a guardian with 4 paws and a beating heart stronger than fear. Life is full of nights that feel endless, nights of loss, doubt, and silence. But just like the dawn that rose over Glenhaven, hope can return when we least expect it. Even in the coldest winter, even in the darkest hour, light still finds its way through. And sometimes that light comes in the form of a faithful companion who refuses to give up on us. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder that miracles still happen. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, or share your own stories of loyalty, love, and the moments when God reached into your life in ways you didn't expect. And if you'd like to join us for more stories like this, stories of courage, redemption, and quiet blessings, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, bless your family, and bless every loyal heart that walks beside you. And may His gentle hand guide you through every storm, just as He guided Ruger and returned Marcy to the light.